I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mack Payne.
This is Mack Payne here with episode 1744 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and all those brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. This podcast is coming to you in the month of May, 2020. History will note that during that month, the entire world was suffering from the COVID-19 pandemic. Many things have been changed or altered or done away with to help fight this virus that's taking so many lives. That includes Memorial Day activities in this country. That is normally celebrated on the last Monday in the month of May. Even though many of these ceremonies are going to be eliminated or drastically reduced, I'm going to carry on this podcast to help memorialize the memories of all the people who served in the Vietnam War, since this is the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. All our other veterans are important, but in this case, I'm looking at the Vietnam War veterans, doing my part to help us never forget their service and sacrifices they made for their country over there in Vietnam. That's why I'm going to share with you a guest essay that recently appeared in the Daily Messenger newspaper up there in Canandaigua, New York. Canandaigua lies right at the northern edge of Canandaigua Lake, one of the Finger Lakes up there in upstate New York, some of the most beautiful country in America. It's also not far from my favorite town in New York, and that's Watertown, right next to Fort Drum, New York. I spent a wonderful summer there years ago, working with a National Guard artillery battalion from upstate Maine, and I was very impressed with those guys from up there. I was very impressed with the whole area up there. There are some great Americans up there in that part of the country. Joel Freedman wrote this guest essay. He lives up there in Canandaigua. He did a great job, and his essay is a great memorial piece to our Vietnam veterans. He's writing about several veterans from that part of the state who served with the 4th of the 5th Infantry, which was a part of the 198th Infantry Brigade assigned to the Americal Division over in Vietnam. The Americal operated between Quy Nhon and Da Nang in that part of the country. They were headquartered in Chu Lai. That's also the division that the infamous Lieutenant William Calley was assigned to. All these guys in the 5th Battalion, 46th Infantry would never do anything like what William Calley did. That's going to be pointed out in this guest essay. Those guys did a real good job over there, and they should never be forgotten. Let's take a look at their story titled, Vietnam War Books Convey Important Message, written by Joel Freedman for the Daily Messenger. Dateline, Canandaigua, New York. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. If I'm not, please forgive me. In Blue Devils in Vietnam, Jim DeCamp, Tony Gurek, Roger Johnson, and many other Vietnam veterans who had attended Genesco Central School shared their experiences before, during, and after their Vietnam service. Livingston County historian Amy Alden, editor of Blue Devils in Vietnam, came to appreciate what it was like to be plucked out of small-town Genesco and plopped into a place on the other side of the world surrounded by jungle and rice paddies and live in fear for an entire year. That's exactly right. When every Vietnam veteran arrived in Vietnam, whether it was in Da Nang, Cam Ranh Bay, or Bien Hoa, when they stepped off that plane, they were in fear of their life for the whole year because no matter where you were, it might have been on the DMZ with the Marines. It might have been with the 1st Cav in the Ai Drang Valley, or the 4th Division up at the Battle of Dak To, or working in an office down in Tan Son Nhut. You knew you could be killed the whole time you were there. And that fear of death lasted with you until you got on that Freedom Bird and flew out of that place. It was a very palpable feeling. The heart-rending stories of Francis Roseborough, Robert Henderson, and Charlie Wilkie, who were killed in action in Vietnam, are included in the book, which is dedicated to them. I'm also hereby issuing those 3 Vietnam veterans an official Vietnam Veteran News podcast salute for their service and sacrifice in Vietnam. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Rest in peace. The veterans in Alden put their hearts and souls into completing an enlightening, insightful, and highly readable book. One of the authors, Roger Johnson, who served in the 5th Battalion, 46th Infantry, called my attention to a book about his battalion by Colonel David W. Taylor of Medina, Ohio, who served as a platoon leader with the 5th Battalion, 46th Infantry, until he was wounded during combat. In June of 1969, as Taylor lay in a Fort Dix, New Jersey Army hospital, he wanted to be with his men in Vietnam while also feeling grateful there were no more sleepless nights waiting to be hit in small perimeters, no unyielding heat, and no anticipation of what lay ahead as my platoon patrolled our assigned terrain. And in that hospital room, there were no more mines. Taylor began wondering what happened to my men after I was wounded. What other missions did they have to endure? Did the battalion acquit itself well in the war? Where else did it go? What did they experience? How did it all end? What happened in the battalion before I arrived? Taylor consciously addressed these and other questions in Our War, the history of sacrifices of an infantry battalion in the Vietnam War, 1968-1971. Just for your information, both of those books are on the recommended reading list for this podcast. You are invited to go over to the podcast website, VietnamVeteranNews.com. There you will find a link to both of those books where you can buy them and be reading them in no time. Back to the essay. Taylor discusses each of the 175 soldiers in the 5th Battalion, 46th Infantry who paid the ultimate price and whose name appears on the Vietnam Wall. For example, on January the 14th, 1970, Private First Class Gilbert Frenchy Benane stepped on a booby-trapped 105mm howitzer round which severely wounded him and 8 comrades. Joseph Atch and others were wounded but struggled to keep Frenchy alive. One of Benane's legs was attached only by skin from the knee to his boot. His stomach was blown wide open, and his comrade stuffed a shirt into the open cavity to hold his intestines inside. Benane survived the chopper ride but died in the hospital hallway as they wheeled him to surgery. His loss of blood was too much, despite the efforts of his wounded comrades to keep him alive. Gilbert Benane was age 22 and single from New Orleans, Louisiana. The attack on Hill 76 on February the 1st, 1971, was the last major firefighting resulting in heavy casualties for 5th of the 46th. Among those answering the final roll call that night was Spec 4 Stephen Edward Warren, 20, from Rochester. Taylor quotes Amy Chadwick, Warren's fiancée, who wrote 30 years later, "I can still remember the face, the shades worn when he boarded the plane in Rochester, New York. That was the last time I saw him alive." That was July 1970. I still have every single letter written to me. I have an 8x10 U.S. Army picture framed. He's frozen in time within that frame. He was my soulmate. Taylor explains the Vietnam Wall has become a catharsis for many of the battalion's veterans, as it has for many other Vietnam veterans. One battalion veteran from A Company saw 2 soldiers in Vietnam die in separate incidences where he should have been. He recalls, 2 people died in my place. It took PTSD therapy and a couple of visits to the wall to help me deal with it and move on. I guess the Lord just wasn't through with me. Second Lieutenant Michael Fouts of Roseburg, Oregon, and Staff Sergeant Carl Bauer of Rock Island, Illinois, who were both killed in action and are discussed in Taylor's book, are also described by Johnson in Blue Devils in Vietnam. Fouts was Johnson's platoon commander. Bauer was Johnson's squad leader. Fouts was always making contact with platoon members, asking how they were and what was on their mind. It was very easy to see that he was a very good leader and that he truly cared for the men who served with him and who would have followed him anywhere. After a firefight with the Viet Cong, we were coming to grips with the fact that we had just lost our beloved Lieutenant Fouts. He was killed, and a second platoon mate and friend was seriously wounded. Squad leader Bauer did not order squad members to do anything dangerous he wasn't willing to do himself. Bauer was killed during combat after selecting himself to perform an especially dangerous task. It was during my most recent visit to the Trail of Remembrance at Canandaigua's American Legion post 3 weeks before Memorial Day that I decided to focus on Blue Devils in Vietnam and our war for this essay. Both books required many years of writing, planning, and research because, as Blue Devils in Vietnam explains, we came home blessed with life and the ability to tell our story and to remember those who cannot. According to Taylor, writing this detailed history did not come easy, but he wrote our war to forever keep alive the memory of their courage, struggles, and sacrifices. Blue Devils in Vietnam and Our War provide not only memorable perspectives about the Vietnam War and its legacy, but also help us to better appreciate the true meaning of wartime service and sacrifice by all who served honorably in all our wars. We should remember not only on Memorial Day and Veterans Day, but also throughout the year. That was Joel Freedman's essay in the Daily Messenger up there in Canandaigua, New York, that honors the men who served in Vietnam, especially those who made the ultimate sacrifice. I do encourage you to read both of those books, and it will better help you understand more about the men who served in Vietnam. They were members of the Vietnam veteran generation, one as great as any that ever heeded the call of duty from its country. I salute them all. I also want to thank Joel Freedman for writing this essay that highlights some of the veterans who served from upstate New York and other locations. It is a great generation, and we should always remember them. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. This is Mack Payne closing out episode 1744 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for listening to these programs. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?